So welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Carrie Kosicki, and I'm the Montgomery County Advocacy Manager for the Coalition for Smarter Growth, as well as the coordinator for the grassroots organization Montgomery for All. And we are here tonight to talk about the problem with parking mandates. And we're really excited to have an excellent group of speakers joining us to talk about parking mandates and what they currently look like nationally and in Montgomery County. How parking reform can support our housing and climate goals. And we'll also get a little bit of a sneak peek about some forthcoming legislation on parking reform that we should see coming soon to the Montgomery County Council. So we're gonna just quickly start with some basic Zoom etiquette since we're on Zoom tonight. Please keep yourself muted. We have a lot of folks on this call and we want to make sure that we're able to hear and follow our speakers. We also are going to have a Q&A session at the end of our speakers' presentations. So if you have any questions that come to you anytime during the presentations, anytime during this call, please put them in the Q&A feature specifically. I'm going to try to kind of keep the chat clear for if you have any sort of issue with like audio or video, you can let me know using the chat and I will work with you to try to resolve that. But to make sure that your questions are answered and that we see them for the end of the call, make sure those go in the Q&A feature. And we will not be stopping to answer those questions during the presentations, but we will save those for the end of the call and answer them then. And just for your awareness, tonight's webinar is being recorded and the recording will be sent out and available after tonight's event, probably later this week. So the webinar is co-hosted by the Coalition for Smarter Growth and Montgomery for All. CSG, the Coalition for Smarter Growth, is the leading organization in the Washington, D.C. region that is dedicated to advocating for smart growth. Our mission is advocating for walkable, bikeable, and transit-oriented places as the most sustainable and equitable way for our region to grow and provide opportunities for everyone. And Montgomery for All is a grassroots organization and community-led, advocating for sustainable and inclusive land use, housing, and transportation policy in Montgomery County, Maryland. We were originally founded to advocate for the Thrive 2050 General Plan, and Montgomery for All is organized and supported by the Coalition for Smarter Growth and also supported by our $5 a year member dues. So later I'm going to give you a little bit more information about joining Montgomery for All. I think it's a great investment. I'm a little biased, but really, really excited to be hosting this webinar on behalf of both groups this evening. And so with that, I'm going to pass it over to Carly to tell you a little bit more about the webinar tonight.
Hello, everybody. I'm very excited to be here tonight, and I'm even more excited to introduce our 5 very knowledgeable and very amazing speakers today. And so they will ultimately help us gain a deeper understanding on parking policy, both in Montgomery County and on a broader level. And so today we are joined by the following experts. Chris Fornash, who is a transportation planning consultant at Nelson Nygaard, who has paved the way for smart growth and parking policy for years. State Delegate David Moon, who represents District 20, Montgomery County, and has spent valuable time on parking reform policies. Jason Sartori, who is the lead countywide planner for the Montgomery County Planning Department, who is responsible for transportation planning and implementing transportation networks and modeling. And lastly, representing some of our Montgomery Council members, we have Montgomery Vice Council President Andrew Friedson's Chief of Staff Cindy Gibson, as well as Council Member Kristen Mink's Chief of Staff Chris Wilhelm. Now, before we hear from these incredible speakers, I would like to provide some basic background on the issue with parking minimums. As a rising senior at the University of Maryland studying public policy, who before working with the Coalition for Smarter Growth was not as familiar with smart growth and urban development, I had no idea that parking impacted so many aspects of our lives. Eliminating parking mandates is such an important piece to the smart growth puzzle, as it not only allows for more pedestrian-friendly, walkable neighborhoods, but it can also decrease rent prices and positively influence traffic patterns. Spending the past 3 months of my internship with the idea of smart growth constantly in my mind, I came to realize how these parking mandates are hindering our livelihoods more than they are helping. With an immense amount of free parking, driving becomes the cheapest and easiest form of transportation. The more that people drive, the harder it is to generate density and demand for good public transit services. In addition, adding parking to developments makes for much more expensive building costs, as well as a large parking lot or parking garage that takes the space of what could have been a multi-use development in a prime location. So this really got me thinking about how important this issue is, and this is why I'm so excited that we have this incredible panel here today to talk more about how we got to this point and what we can do to move forward. With that being said, I will now turn it over to Chris Fornash, who will explain why these parking minimums are such a big problem.
Thanks, Carly. Inevitably fumbling for the mute button and the right screen share button. Thanks for the introduction and thanks for the opportunity to be part of the webinar tonight. First, I'd like to acknowledge I see lots of familiar names participating in the webinar tonight, many of whom have been working on urbanism and smart growth and related issues in the region and in the country for everybody as long as I have. So I want to note that some of this material might come off as slightly basic to you. Bear with. I'm also offering it as an example of how we've found it works to communicate with a more general public about the issues Carly was describing, about the, if not centrality, at least instrumentality of parking in our everyday lives and how our communities grow and how we enjoy them. We at Nelson Nygaard work across the country. There are about 170 of us. We work in most major cities and many suburbs across the country on a variety of transportation planning and policy projects, all centered around sustainability, equity, and safety. Those are the pillars of our work, and I'm proud that we live up to those values on every project we work on. Not all of our work involves parking. We do a lot of transit planning, in fact, some currently in Montgomery County, and lots of general multimodal transportation planning. If you've ridden across the National Mall on the new cycle track on 15th Street that went in about 15, 18 months ago now, that was our project and a good illustration of the crucial kind of work that we do in this market and beyond. With respect to parking, I want to quickly note that Fairfax County Planning Commission just last month, was it last month already? I think it was. Had their first public hearing on changing the Fairfax County zoning code to reform their outdated parking requirements. That's work that we've led. That'll be going back to their planning commission in September and then hopefully to their board before the end of the year. And I'll note that it addresses, well, many of the concerns that I'm sure we'll hear about throughout not just my part of the presentation, but the discussion further on. So there's work going on in roughly equivalent, although certainly not as good as Montgomery County, but roughly equivalent jurisdictions in the region that you can look to for some guidance and inspiration. So let me dive in. Let me offer one more bona fide before I keep going, which is that I've lived in this region for 30 years at this point, and was on the Planning Commission and chaired the Planning Commission in Arlington County for a while in the last decade. And that's really my lens on the actual mechanics of how development works, right? Often I'll find that transportation planners understand how public resources get spent to improve the public right-of-way and what good design looks like for streets and transit systems, et cetera, but maybe don't understand the dynamics of the development market. And while it's true that if you've seen how development works in one jurisdiction, you've seen how it works in one jurisdiction because it's extremely bespoke and at least in Arlington's case, baroque and probably also broken. It's incumbent on us as transportation professionals to really understand how development works and understand that no matter how good we get the public right-of-way, if the accompanying development isn't the kind of development that Carrie and Carly described and that CSG supports, walkable, mixed-use, transit-friendly development, then we've probably wasted a lot of transportation dollars in a place where they could be better put to use supporting good urbanism. So now I will proceed with my presentation. So at a very basic level in Montgomery County and most parts of the country, any new property development must include off-street parking, right? When we're talking about parking requirements, we shorthand that, but really that's what we're talking about. Any new property development, and property development is generally, in most places, governed by a zoning code, not just a zoning code, probably a building code, probably lots of other ancillary codes as well. But at the at the crux of the matter, what we're talking about is new development requiring off-street parking. And often that's just not new development, but new uses in existing development as well, which can be problematic given that parking is not as flexible as potential reuse of buildings. The most common form of parking standards are minimums. We shorthand that in many ways too, just as parking requirements or parking minimums. And importantly, they apply to just about every kind of property development. And the purpose fundamentally is not to right size. In the Fairfax County work I described, it's really framed as right sizing parking. In general, when you dig into how these rates were formed, how the requirements are formed, it's requiring an oversupply of parking, because it's essentially, if there's any science behind it, and in many cases there isn't, or whatever science or data was behind the setting of the rates happened 50 years ago and we're still using the same rates. But those rates, and then the classic engineering approach of building safety factors on top, means that our requirements are essentially designed to oversupply parking. What happens when you have an oversupply? Well, you have some positive impacts, which is everybody can find parking everywhere they want to drive, although that has deleterious effects we'll get into in a moment. But it also means the price of parking is essentially zero, because there's such an abundant supply everywhere that there's simply not the constraints that would allow a market to be created. I know that's not true in many parts of Montgomery County, but in general, it's true in most of the country, and I'm sure in many parts of Montgomery County. So parking minimums seek to oversupply parking, and that is oversupply even assuming that the only way people can get to this particular property is by driving. It's a terrible feedback loop when it comes to urbanism. It shapes our communities around parking, which makes us more dependent on driving, which means we need more parking, et cetera. And we end up with landscapes that look like the picture below, which is isolated buildings surrounded by large fields of parking. This is not in Montgomery County, so don't be trying to figure out which highway that is. We know that parking facilities, especially if they get to be of any size, more than a few spaces, are not appealing places. And outside of that car storage, they don't add any value to our communities. They don't add any property tax value that's returned in a fiscal sense to our communities. They don't add any placemaking value. The odd parking lot gets reused as a farmer's market occasionally, or as a place for public gathering in that sense. But in general, all this space doesn't provide any value apart from a limited amount of car storage. Too much parking also pushes places apart. As we saw in that air photo, once you start trying to park every single plot of land, every single parcel, the effect essentially becomes pushing those destinations further and further apart, which is part of that cycle that I described before: more parking, more driving, more parking, more driving. So here you see I've used a name in this. This is part of our, and I'll go into this a little bit further on, but part of the way we find it best to communicate with the general public, again, that needs to understand parking, is by personalizing it in a sense. And so the name Raquel, you'll see come up again later. I reshuffled some slides for this presentation. But for people like this particular traveler, it makes trying to walk or trying to take transit in a place that is built solely for driving that much further, strictly speaking of distance, but really that much less safe feeling, that much less pleasant feeling. And when it comes down to it, if we want people to try travel modes other than driving, we need to make them not just possible in a theoretical sense, but attractive and safe and convenient and preferred. So with different parking regulations, we can get our destinations closer together. That makes choosing other modes more possible. And it makes the spaces that we create by reducing the amount of parking safer, more vibrant, and contributing more in general to our community life. Whoops, duplicated that one. So just a couple of notes on how, again, to communicate parking to a more general audience. So if you have 1 square foot of development, a typical parking code is requiring 8+ square feet of parking space. That's what that first stall bar means. And for a restaurant use, the code's requiring essentially 8 times as much space to be used for parking as is used for the restaurant, for the dining establishment. About 4 times as much parking space is required than gym space for that use. And even for an office, which you think offices tend to not require quite as much ancillary space as dining or having a gym would, even an office use requires more space to be allocated for parking than for the actual office use. Once you get down to apartments and living space, the ratio flips, but essentially still an exorbitant amount of space has to be allocated for parking compared to the space allocated for actual use, other than for car storage. Given that our land area is fixed, and can we argue about this? Sprawl is an example of how our urbanized area doesn't seem fixed. It can expand, and in some ways in the past might have felt like it could expand infinitely. But essentially our land is fixed. The land in the county is fixed. The land in the part of the county that we want to be urbanized is fixed. So space used for parking is space that almost definitionally is not used for something else that provides more value in so many ways. And at the end of the day, the regulations we put in place are an expression of our values, right? We've all probably heard the phrase that our budget reflects our values. Well, our regulations express our values too, and our regulations are essentially saying empty housing, and we'll get into utilization a little bit further, empty housing for cars is more important than actual housing for people. It's more important than actual places for people to live their lives. So one of the key elements I know of talking about how to reform parking in Montgomery County in many places is first of all drawing people's attention to the various ways in which parking undermines your broader goals. And I want to start with the one that really is most trenchant in a number of places now, which is housing affordability. So I'll spend more time on that one than the others. The others I'll basically breeze past, but we can talk more about that in the Q&A if you want. So here's the kind of, again, literally cartoonish way that we try to communicate about how parking affects people's lives and about how changing parking might make their lives better. So here in this case, a renter, a homeowner, a shopkeeper, a developer, and a planner, 5 roles that pretty much everybody can understand and hopefully see themselves in at least one of these roles. So parking minimums make housing more expensive. What does that mean? Now, market to market, these prices vary, but surface parking, generally, we see numbers in many markets in the county, about $5,000 to build a surface parking space. That's irrespective of land costs. Structured parking, much larger, $25,000 to $50,000 per space, possibly more if that structured parking is underground, depending on how far down you have to go. And this cost, of course, gets absorbed or reflected in the cost of property, both the cost of buying and selling property, so the property value, but also the ongoing operations and maintenance costs, which inevitably is passed on to the end user, whether those are residents or business tenants. And if they're business tenants, especially retail, then passed on to those customers as well. At a national level, a parking space adds, this is a national level looking at urban areas. So this is not looking at purely rural or small town context, but looking across urban areas, a parking space adds almost $150 a month to rent. That's the cost of the parking space, building it, maintaining it, et cetera. But for many people who don't need the car parking, you're all familiar, I'm sure, with unbundling as a concept. I know it's used in some cases in Montgomery County and elsewhere. Here, Renter Renee is our exemplar of someone who doesn't need the car parking and could take advantage of a tool like unbundling.
Chris, can you tell us what unbundling is?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And you of course, have blanket permission to call me out on jargon and acronyms. So unbundling here refers to separating the cost of paying for parking from the cost of paying for other services. So in the case of renting an apartment, it would be separating the cost of renting the apartment itself versus the additional cost of renting or leasing a parking space month to month. It can also apply to simply pricing parking at retail establishments and other places where somebody is paying for that parking and it's reflecting the cost of that parking to the end user rather than internalizing it and making everyone pay for it. So I don't know that this is true in Montgomery County, so forgive me if it's not, but in most cases, there are even parking minimums for affordable housing. And we know from talking to people who live in affordable housing and also from national number averages that vehicle ownership is quite a bit lower in most cases, in most markets, for people who are able to take advantage of affordable housing, subsidized housing. Vehicle ownership is lower than for families and households in general. So nearly a third of families, excuse me, just more than a third of families that could qualify for affordable housing in general don't own a car. And this is deeply affordable. This is looking at the 30% level for those of you who are working closely in the affordable housing market. So if the developer has to build the parking, even when they know that, with a blanket code that doesn't recognize the difference between affordable housing and market rate housing, developers having to build parking when they know it's going to increase rent and much of it is going to go unused, that's driving up their costs of providing housing, and those costs have to be absorbed somewhere. It's been thankfully a long time now, but I remember discussions with an affordable housing developer in Arlington County where we were trying very hard to get them, this is thankfully well more than a decade ago at this point, trying to get them to understand that we knew that their tenants didn't own cars at the same rate as market rate housing, people living in market rate housing, and therefore couldn't they build less housing, and ultimately got them to understand that they could, should, and wanted to. And it was their lenders at that point who were saying, no, you can't build these affordable units without at least one space per unit. So it feels like in many cases, our affordable housing developers, especially in the sophisticated market in the Washington region, understand this at a deep level and have gotten their lenders on board. And in many cases, it's the codes that are still trying to play catch up. So upshot there, without the parking minimums, they could build more affordable housing with less parking. And given that affordable housing, especially at those deep affordability levels, requires some sort of subsidy from a local government typically or some other source, that's producing more housing with less investment from the public sector. And the renter has more choices. And if this gets at the point I just made in different words, which is for the planners, for those of us on the government side, for those of you on the government side, you don't have to invest as much to create the same amount of housing, or you can afford to create more housing for the same investment. So I spent some time on affordable housing, as I mentioned. I'm going to spend less time on these, but business flexibility is really, it was an issue pre-COVID, it was an issue pre-COVID and became even more obvious during COVID as businesses or property owners wanted to adjust the use in the space they had. Maybe the previous use simply wasn't tenable under COVID. Maybe that business went out of business and they want to replace it with something that's, retail where it wasn't before, or vice versa. Often the parking codes get in the way of that change of use. And we're working with a number of jurisdictions now that are simply waiving the requirement for changing the amount of parking when there's a use change. Some parameters around that, of course, but essentially making it more frictionless to change use in existing spaces. From an economic development standpoint, right, this slide, it almost seems fake to me, but I know these two properties are literally across the street from each other in St. Paul, Minnesota, where we worked with the local government to eliminate their minimum parking requirements for almost every use in almost every case. And this illustrates on the left, that is, you can see it in the back a little bit, but you can see that there's essentially a big surface parking lot associated with that parcel. And so when you look at the whole parcel, including the building and the parking, the market value is relatively low. Well, the market value is what it is, $49 a square foot, but the tax revenue that's returned to the local jurisdiction is $2 per square foot. On the right, you have a mixed-use building. It's denser, right? There's residential on top of retail, and it has some structured parking, but less than would have been required under a course code like what produced the building on the left. But you see a factor of 13 in the market value, and an equivalent factor of 6 in the tax revenue per square foot. So from an economic development perspective, from a fiscal benefit to the local government perspective, flexing on the minimum parking requirements can be a real economic development tool as well. So apart from affordable housing, I know another issue of great concern in Montgomery County and many jurisdictions is our contribution to the ongoing climate crisis. I know that Montgomery County is aiming to eliminate greenhouse gases by 2035. 40% of the emissions, at least in the most recent inventory in Montgomery County, were transportation related. That's not all personal transportation. That's off-road. That includes some other sources. But 40% of the county's carbon emissions are from vehicle travel. Well, how does that relate to parking minimums? Again, this is an audience that probably understands it fairly deeply, but the more parking there is, the more incentive there is to just drive, but because destinations are further apart, because the price of parking is suppressed, even if people might otherwise be happy taking lower emissions options. And of course, when you take the urban form feedback into account, it's harder to take advantage of those options like walking and biking in transit. I'll note that as a crucial accompaniment to parking code changes is TDM strategies, and Montgomery County has a very advanced set of TDM tools. I know both in the sort of business district level and at the county level. So this is not meant to be instructive so much as reinforcing that when we're talking about changing parking, I often with my TDM focused colleagues get into discussion
What's
about
TDM?
Thank you. I thought you'd never ask, Gary. TDM, well, actually, it does depend on who you ask. Here, I'm using it to mean travel demand management. So it's a set of, well, as it briefly describes on the right, it's a set of tools to manage the demand for driving, right? It really grew out of an effort to take, a little bit of traffic off of our most congested facilities in the worst parts of the peak period, right? So what can you do to get people to change? Things like subsidies to move to transit, things like creating commuter-focused transit service, all the way down. So it includes economic incentives as well as improvements to the alternatives to driving. And there, I just want to emphasize it's two things, right? You have to have two things for people to consider doing something other than what they've always done. And one is that they have real choices, right? Not that we say, oh no, there's transit service. And then when you actually look at the choices people have, it's a bus that comes every hour, 6 times a day, right? That's not going to fit many people's needs. So they have to have real choices. And then to get people to change behavior, you have to make them aware those choices exist and possibly provide incentives for them to at least try those other behaviors. So I'll get down off my TDM soapbox here for the moment at least. So without parking minimums, we can reduce the incentive to drive, making the alternatives more appealing and reach the climate goals faster. And I'm wrapping up here. Again, this is not meant to be, well, not meant to be entirely self-serving, but this sort of report card format is one that we find actually speaks to a more general public, and one that I would encourage you to, when you're speaking to constituents, when you're speaking to, all of these audiences, think about communicating in ways like this. So this is essentially just the report card for those 4 categories. And, you don't want to oversell it, right? The shopkeeper isn't going to see much benefit from housing affordability changes, or at least not much direct benefit. So, not everywhere is getting a thumbs up. And sometimes when we do scoring like this, you'll see some, at least mixed and maybe even thumbs down. So somebody's seeing a disbenefit. So that's something that needs to be taken into account as well. I'm going to stop here. I've talked well past my few minutes, but just for the record, I had permission to go a little bit longer and cede the floor to the others. But thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, Chris. And now we will be hearing from Delegate David Moon, who's going to be explaining more about the parking reform legislation that he has worked on and what led him to focusing on this topic.
Thank you so much for having me, folks. And I do want to apologize for my beat up looking face. I took a bad spill over the weekend and face planted, but I am still happy to talk parking policy tonight. I don't have a slideshow, so instead what I'm going to try and do is give you a very frank peek under the hood of the legislative process and how and why this particular bill came about. While I am talking, I will drop into the webinar chat box a link to the bill page, HB 819 from this year, that I'm going to be talking about. So who am I? Delegate David Moon. I'm 9 years into serving in the Maryland House of Delegates. And for context, my district is Tacoma Park, Silver Spring, and parts north up to Hillendale and Colesville. But important to this conversation is that I have at least 2 or 3 red line metro stations that my residents regularly and easily access. And I have a number of purple line stations. Most of any of the legislative districts are in my legislative district in Maryland. So a number of purple line stations coming on board. In the past, I was professionally interested in this work, both as campaign director for Purple Line Now and interim executive director for Communities for Transit, which worked on bus rapid transit. So what brought me to look at parking minimums in Montgomery County? Well, I've been interested in land use and transit for many reasons, but at the top of mind lately would be sustainability and economic justice reasons. And I would put that both in terms of housing and transportation costs. So if you've been following the news, especially the last few years, as I have, you will have heard from constituents, neighbors alike about the high cost of housing, both for renters and for would-be home buyers. So that's where I enter the story with HB 819 this year. So what did the bill do? It simply said the state was going to pass a law that was essentially going to ban Montgomery County from enforcing its existing parking requirements that it has on new residential construction, housing. And we were just going to cast those aside and say, actually, we're not going to do that. To make it easy to digest and understand the policy concepts for why we did this, we wanted to start slow and easy. And so we said, we are going to ban these parking requirements within a quarter mile of a metro station or a future Purple Line station in Montgomery County. In other words, if new housing is being built basically on top of a light rail or metro station in Montgomery County, we don't think that the county needs to continue requiring a parking spot for essentially every bedroom being constructed. So that was the basic proposal. The prior speaker gave you some information about why that would be, but I want to give you some context and color here. One of my colleagues, who used to be a Rockville City Council member, quoted to us in the course of the bill hearings on this topic that in their time in Rockville, and this would be very specific, they were quoted $40,000 to $50,000 as the cost for underground parking that would be required for projects in the city of Rockville, again, right next to a metro station. And that added cost was enough concern for them and many of my colleagues to, again, consider adding $50,000 to every residential unit in Montgomery County that's already on top of a transit station for the purposes of requiring the developer to build underground parking did not make sense in the context of the ambitious climate goals we've been setting and the housing affordability crisis that we are all trying to confront. So many have asked, and I've seen them, some clown it. Why just Montgomery County? Why not look at a Maryland bill? Someone on Twitter asked, what's with Maryland and all of these county-specific bills? Well, I've been paying attention, like many of you, to what's going on in other states. Red states like Montana, blue states like California have been undertaking some very interesting and significant revisions of their laws to preempt local zoning. In other words, those states are beginning to look at overruling local governments on zoning, which, is sort of a long-standing third rail of politics. Local zoning is local. And so I asked myself, is Maryland ready to undertake one of these bold steps and undertake a statewide zoning reform of this type? And at the same time, this conversation was happening. Prince George's County was talking about banning townhouses. Arlington nearby was having some interesting debates about missing middle housing. And I decided I wanted to take a more surgical approach and try a test. Again, of course, on the basic policy, which I presented to you, HB 819, should Montgomery County require a parking spot for every bedroom? But more importantly, on this larger question, was Maryland ready to begin the process of preempting local governments on zoning? Is the state and its lawmakers ready to make zoning a state policy matter and begin doing this? And so this was the other reason for the bill. So what happened? Well, we introduced this as a Montgomery County bill, and usually when that happens, something called local courtesy in Maryland is applied, where if the locals support it and it only affects the locals, the rest of the state is expected generally to support the local decision that was made. And in this instance, I didn't know this was going to happen, but surprisingly, this bill passed unanimously out of the Montgomery County House and Senate, House delegation. And so it had actually no opposition in Montgomery County whatsoever. And that meant it was sent on to the House Environment Transportation Committee for a look, begin to be looked at by the statewide set of lawmakers. So what happened there? Well, as you can imagine, the Coalition for Smarter Growth, the Sierra Club, Greater Washington, some of these groups supported the bill. The Unitarians even came out to support a ban on parking requirements in Montgomery County near transit. But interestingly enough, the county's park and planning chair at the time testified against the bill. The county executive opposed the bill, and both of them cited preemption. In other words, wanting the state not to overrule the local government as their opposition, not necessarily on grounds of what it was the bill was proposing to do. So that's where we left things. The bill, nevertheless, we said, well, we'd like to see how far we can take this. The bill proceeded a step further, and it went to the floor. And this was the next gut checkpoint, where actually even that it passed 128-0. I want to make that clear. So in fact, I was correct. Local courtesy was respected. It got a unanimous vote from Trump supporters and Biden supporters and socialists and everything and the like. It was a unanimously supported bill. And so I can tell you where I'm going to leave this, and hopefully we can have some room for a Q&A, is on this larger question about, yes, we moved the policies, but because of what's going on in Montana, California, and the gravity of the types of reforms we're trying to attempt that very clearly are being held up by the hodgepodge network of local governments all exercising local zoning control, I'm now beginning to look at the specifics and this larger enterprise about zoning preemption. Now, that being said, we're very nice people, and in Montgomery County, we happen to be dealing with a local government that, despite the park and planning chair and the county executive opposing it, the council seems to be interested in this question. And so we are, for the moment, going to step aside from overruling the county on parking requirements and allow them to have their conversation, because I do take them at good faith that they intend to make these types of reforms, and you'll hear from some of them later. But again, the larger question for me is statewide zoning preemption, what it should include, and how do we get there? And this is obviously a very important educational tool on that road. So thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you so much, Delegate Moon. Now we will be passing it off to Jason Sartori, who will be speaking about county planning and parking mandates in Montgomery County.
Great. Thank you, Carly. And thank you to CSG and Montgomery for All for hosting this and for inviting me to participate. So I'm going to just give a quick overview of what we currently have in place in Montgomery County. And you'll see some of the things that I may mention may be repetitive with what you've already heard. So it's good to see that there's kind of some consistency in thought here. First, where our parking minimums lie within the county code is in Chapter 59, which is our zoning code. So the zoning code identifies essentially 4 different kind of geographies that are based on land use, well, zone and location within the county, but then also within those, it sets up a different parking minimum for each type of use. And the geographies, though, that kind of dictate this are parking lot districts, reduced parking areas. Then we've got kind of a hodgepodge of certain commercial and employment zones that are not near transit. And then we've got everything else. And so I've got a convenient map to show you what that looks like. It may not show the cleanest on here. The gray, the largest area is in gray. It's basically everywhere throughout the county. That includes our agricultural zones, our rural residential zones, our other residential, and let's see, I just want to make sure I get them all here, and our industrial zones. The what you see, you may not be able to tell, but down here in Silver Spring, Bethesda, Wheaton, and in Montgomery Hills, we have our 4 parking lot districts in pink. I'll zoom in on those in a second. We have our reduced parking areas. These are certain commercial zones and employment zones anywhere in the county. And then for other ones, if they're located within 1 mile of transit, those are all the areas you see in orange. And then finally, the blue areas, these few places here and there, these are those other commercial zones that aren't located near transit. So I'll talk a little bit about each of these, well, a couple of them in a little more detail here. So parking lot districts. These are special taxing districts that are designated actually in Chapter 60 of the code. And if you go to Chapter 60 and look at this, these are really meets and bounds types of descriptions of where these are located. And I think they've been this way for decades. But essentially, again, it's 4. It really, if you look at the code, it's really 3. Montgomery Hills is technically part of the Silver Spring parking lot district, but it's these 4 areas: Wheaton, downtown Wheaton, downtown Silver Spring, downtown Bethesda, and then Montgomery Hills here is kind of hidden. It's pretty small. Here they are kind of zoomed in, not to scale to each other here, but I did want to highlight, here's what we currently have. I believe this is from Data Montgomery. I believe these are the public parking spaces that are available in each of these districts. So you get a sense of just how much parking we already provide in these 4 areas of the county. And then there's the reduced parking areas. Those were the areas that showed up in orange in the map that I showed. Again, these are defined by the zoning and their location. So if you're in our commercial residential zone, our CRT is our commercial residential town zone. LSC is our life sciences center zone, and then EOF is our employment office zone. Anywhere in the county, you're automatically in the reduced parking area. And then if you're in these 3 other zones, the CRN is our commercial residential neighborhood zone. NR is our neighborhood retail zone, which is kind of commercial areas with more of a neighborhood orientation. Those tend to be a little more auto-oriented retail areas. And then our general retail, these are commercial areas kind of a general sense, more like regional shopping centers. And if they are located within 1 mile of a transit station or stop, then they're also in part included in the reduced parking areas. So here's just a zoomed in example of Bethesda. All of these neighborhoods here are part of that gray area. And then you've got the parking lot district does not encompass all of downtown Bethesda, not all of the CBD, or not all of the downtown Bethesda downtown master plan area. But then you've got the orange. These are our reduced parking areas. So how do you actually use this today? I kind of recreated a table that exists in the zoning code, and I'm going to focus in on just the residential component of this, but essentially this is like a 6-page table that we have for every single use. And I mentioned that we distinguish the 4 different types here, but for each use, there's a particular type of metric that's used depending on, in the case of residential, we're looking at it per unit. So the first grouping was all of the gray area. So these are our standard parking minimums across the county, most of the county. So just looking at what we currently require for single family and duplexes and townhouses, it's 2 off-street parking spaces per unit. You can see multifamily, it depends on the number and distribution of units based on number of bedrooms in that building. Then when you get to the areas that we're mostly talking about and where we see most of our new development occurring in the county are infill areas. So I've tried to distinguish here again in the colors that you saw on the map, the orange and pink. We have for our parking lot districts and reduced parking areas, we actually establish in the code both parking baseline minimums and baseline maximums. So you can see the minimums in those areas for all types of residential units are set at 1 per unit, regardless of the type of unit. The baseline maximums are here. And then blue, these were those areas in those 3 commercial zones that aren't located near transit. You can see they have their own set of rates that actually mimic the baseline minimums in all of the gray areas. So you could really combine them. So now within our parking lot district and reduced parking areas, there are some reductions that an applicant can apply for or request. And so you're not actually bound by those parking minimums. So technically, as the zoning code is written, an applicant can provide fewer parking spaces in the parking lot district if they make a payment to the county. In practice, I'm not exactly sure that's exactly what's happening. And so I'm not, from a revenue perspective, I don't believe that this is a major revenue source for the county. But what you'll find if you take a look at projects that have been approved recently is that a good number of them are coming in with parking that is well below the required minimum. And then same thing in the reduced parking areas, it's a little different. You can request a waiver, but we also see that a lot come in there. And I will tell you, when we kind of did a scan of recent projects over the last few years, a good number of them are coming in below the minimums in our parking lot districts and reduced parking areas. And then there are a good chunk that come in between the minimum and the maximum, which kind of suggests that in those cases, the minimum didn't really play a role. The market kind of dictated that the applicant felt they needed more, and so they were building more. And in the cases where they were coming in below the minimums, you got a sense of, well, there seems to be a good amount of flexibility in the system already to be able to provide less than the minimum. But then there are a few that come in right at the minimum. You have to question whether or not the minimum is really forcing them to build more parking than they would otherwise. I'm not going to go through these, but if you look in the zoning code, there are a slew of a bunch of other adjustments that can be made that can reduce the amount of parking that an applicant would have to provide. The kind of takeaway that I would have with this is just that it gets really complicated. And one potential benefit of cleaning this up or eliminating parking minimums in certain areas is to remove some of this complication. One thing, okay, so I did want to just highlight, as Delegate Moon mentioned, the commission and the county executive team did not support his bill last session. I wanted to give a little bit more insight into that, and certainly the local preemption was a part of that. And I think that in some ways, if the bill applied to the entire state, it would be feel a little different than a bill that's applied specifically to Montgomery County. Personally, speaking on my own behalf here, I would rather see the state provide more incentive to local jurisdictions to make these types of changes, not just here, but also on things like our single family zones. But that's not a topic for another panel. I would say one of the other key things about the bill that we were concerned with was the way it restricted the district council, which is the county council, from enforcing the parking minimums. Unfortunately, it's not the county council that does that enforcement. The enforcement occurs when the planning board is reviewing a development application for preliminary plans or site plans. It occurs when the hearing examiner is reviewing conditional use applications. And it's enforced when the Department of Permitting Services in the executive branch reviews a development application or permit and ensures that it's consistent with our zoning code and consistent with the conditions of approval that came from the planning board or from the hearing examiner. So these are the bodies that are really doing the enforcement of that. And so as the bill was written, it would have restricted the district council, the county council from creating any new parking minimums, but it had no effect on whether or not the planning board or any of these other bodies here could enforce it. And so they would still be enforcing the zoning code as written. And so the preferred option would be to see the county council adopt a zoning text amendment that would make the change, because we actually were pretty supportive of the intent behind Delegate Moon's bill. And I had this slide here talking about the impacts of parking minimums. I think Chris did a really good job of kind of summarizing these. I would say we've seen consistently this idea that a parking space can cost between $10,000 and $40,000 per space, but we've also heard rumors of as much as $70,000. So it could get really, really expensive depending on where you are in the county and what type of structure you're building. In places like Bethesda, where you hit bedrock pretty quickly going down, the cost of building an underground garage is quite high. So I did want to talk a little bit, this is, I think, my last slide here, just about eliminating parking minimums. And there's some consistency here with Thrive Montgomery 2050, which is the county's new general plan. It actually has a policy dedicated to parking requirements in there that says, manage parking efficiently and equitably by charging market rates and reducing the supply of public and private parking where appropriate. And I think it was mentioned earlier a couple of times that, providing free parking or having excess parking availability just encourages more people to drive to our larger activity centers. And, this is where it kind of ties into some of the other concepts in Thrive where we talk about 15-minute living. If we are charging appropriately for our public parking, and we're limiting the supply of it, some people will make a decision to not go to downtown Silver Spring for some of the things they're looking for, or to Bethesda, some of our larger activity centers, because they don't want to have to try to find parking. And that's fine, but it's especially fine if we can provide them with a lot of those amenities closer into where they are living. So the idea of 15-minute living and having things that are within a close commute of walking or biking, or if you have to buy car, we want to make sure that we have those in other places too. So it's kind of all these different things tie together. The other thing I would say is obviously one is, this was talked about, if we're requiring parking, we're preventing that from being other uses. Well, if we can focus in on some of the places where we have some underutilized parking lots and garages, they should certainly be targeted for redevelopment. And without parking minimums, we can get more of the things that we want to see in those areas. And so we've been doing this in some of our more recent master plans. The Silver Spring Downtown Adjacent Communities Plan did target our underutilized garages for redevelopment opportunities. But I would also say this gives us an opportunity to focus on some other things in our new economy here of curbside management, how we make our downtown areas, our town center areas safer for pedestrians and bicyclists and other users of our roads, but how we also tie into how people are using the curbside differently now. So drop off and pick up, our things like Uber and Lyft, and people stopping in, dropping to pick up food and heading out. But then also micromobility parking, parklets, mobile food vending, other things and other ways that we use some of our, that we could use some of our existing parking in some of our more urban areas. So that is it from my end.
Great. Thank you so much, Jason.
Yep.
Lastly, we're going to be hearing from Montgomery Council Vice President Andrew Frieson's Chief of Staff, Cindy Gibson, and Councilmember Kristen Minks, Chief of Staff, Chris Wilhelm, to share about their forthcoming legislation.
Cindy, you have to go first because Andrew's the Vice President.
You're muted still.
Thank you. Sorry about that. I had to wait for permission to be unmuted.
Sorry. Oops. My bad.
Carrie. Okay, Chris, I'll go first. We don't really, I would say we don't have a lot to report to you right tonight because we are still in the drafting process. But, I think both Chris and I, on behalf of our bosses, are really happy to be here tonight. I think a lot of people in this Zoom room are probably in agreement that this is an important issue to tackle. And that is what we're attempting to do. We learned a lot tonight. Some of it was review. And I think as we draft, we would very much, like everyone's input here. So please feel free to reach out to both of us. And I think that we will come back and report to you with some further details.
Yeah, I don't have a whole lot to add to that, except that Councilmember Mink is really excited to be working on this nascent bill with Councilmember Friedson. Our goal is going to be to craft a bill that makes a meaningful difference to decrease the cost of developing new housing in the right areas. And we're going to work over the next few weeks to loop back with all of the advocates who care about this issue and get this bill right so that it makes a difference and can pass. So we're looking forward to setting up some follow-ups to really get the details nailed down with you all.
Thank you both. I'm sorry. See, I'm trying to unpin people. I am not gifted at Zoom. I think everyone is unpinned now, but yeah, thank you both so much for being here and sharing about that bill. I was really excited to hear that Council members Friedson and Mick are working on this. I remember when I testified in support of David Moon's bill at the council hearing on it, when the council voted to take a position on the bill, that both Councilmember Friedson and Councilmember Mink spoke very strongly in favor of the idea of parking minimum reforms, especially near transit in Montgomery County. And something that I really appreciated that I heard from both of them in particular was, you know, kind of expressing that they were really more comfortable if the county led this initiative because it has to do with the council, but the council and with Montgomery County specifically, but that this is such an important issue when it comes to affordable housing, when it comes to transportation and the impact that car dependence has on the environment, that even with some of the concerns that they had about preemption, that they expressed their support for similar legislation. And, you know, I think in particular, Councilmember Mink said that other places like Delegate Moon shared have done this kind of legislation, even with preemption, and we need to act now. We need to take a step forward. So I'm really looking forward to seeing more about this legislation. And on that note, oh, go ahead, Chris, please.
I was just going to say, I also wanted to thank Delegate Moon for really kickstarting this conversation in Montgomery County. It's also fascinating hearing about kind of the landscape across Maryland and all these different zoning issues that we're going to be tackling over the next couple of years. So really interested to see how all that develops. But thank you, Delegate, for getting the conversation started, and we're excited to work with you on it.
Awesome, thank you. So we're very excited to hear about this bill that's coming to the council. And one of the best ways to keep track of that bill and to advocate for it is to follow along with Coalition for Smarter Growth and with Montgomery for All. I'll be sending email updates and action alerts to support that bill. So right now I am dropping in the chat the link to sign up for as a Montgomery for All member and to sign up for email updates from CSG. For Montgomery for All membership, it costs just $5 a year as a contribution. We also do have fee waivers available, so you can just send me an email if you're not able to make that $5 donation, and we would absolutely be happy to welcome you to Montgomery for All. We do social events, we do advocacy trainings and educational events like this one tonight to advance policies for affordable and equitable housing in Montgomery County. And if you enjoyed tonight's webinar, I really encourage you to join Montgomery for All, be part of this really passionate community of advocates and support with a small donation. So now we are going to move into the Q&A section. I'm seeing some questions in the chat, which I will add into the Q&A. But we have a first question here from Dan Reed. And Dan, feel free. I think I have to ask you to unmute, but then go ahead.
All right, thanks. Hi, everybody. Thanks to Carrie and Carly for organizing this, for everyone who spoke this evening. I'm really excited we're talking about this topic as someone who's worked on this for a long time, both in public and private sectors. One of the things that I've encountered is when developers actually want to provide less parking. The issue isn't parking requirements in that jurisdiction, but financing. Like lenders actually may demand higher parking requirements based on comps that they have. I'm curious if any of the speakers, in particular Chris, could maybe speak, or Jason actually speak to experiences they've had with that, and maybe what are ways to get around it.
I could just say that and I'll let Chris maybe talk to some of the ideas of ways to get around this. He might have some better ideas. That this is certainly something that we have seen here in cases where an applicant was interested in doing less parking than is required, but had a difficult time getting financing for that. And that's problematic. And so I think maybe we need to kind of as an industry, we need to maybe have come together a little bit more with with the banking industry and being able to try to explain the benefits behind removing some of these parking minimums or why they are these projects are viable, and show proof of how they're viable.
Yeah, I'll speak to it briefly. That's, as I mentioned at the top, in the affordable housing example in Arlington from thankfully close to 2 decades ago now, even going directly to the bankers just got, why would we not build this asset as part of this project? Because they see parking as an asset primarily, a bankable, potentially marketable, but an asset to the building that protects them against future change in use, that protects them against all sorts of futures that bankers worry about. That said, I mean, the developers really are the first line, and if you can get the developers to understand and see the value directly to them and to their projects, then going with the developer to the banker is really the only way we found to unlock. And I should say, the vast majority of our clients are local governments and transit agencies. We work with a small number of developers in a few markets, including this one. And it really is, having a developer, whether it's a market rate developer, an affordable housing developer who understands and will, either bring you along as a resource, as an asset to talk to their bankers, or will have that argument with them. I'll say that even with sophisticated developers who get it, they often still are saying, look, we can go low, but we can't go to zero. We can't go to 0.3 spaces per unit. Like, it's just, even our internal marketing people are like, we just can't, we can't guarantee that we can lease up a project at those low rates. Like, so in a sense, that really is unfortunate, because once the parking is there, it's sort of baked in. There's lots of ideas about how to reuse parking for other functions, but most of them aren't really executed. So in a sense, it's a loss. But getting a developer near transit down to even a quarter space per unit is a huge victory compared to where we were. So let's take that. But that's the question of how do you get to your bankers. When I was in the Smart Growth program at EPA, we tried to work on bankers, different kinds of industry associations of the bankers who underwrite those loans, and they just, they're risk averse by nature. And so anything that doesn't, as I think you put it in the question, Dan, isn't a direct comp that they can see and feel and talk to the person who underwrote it and get confidence from them, is going to put them further out on a limb than they're usually willing to go. I don't mean to overstate it, but that's my experience.
Thank you.
Okay, great. Well, we have another question from Zach Weinstein, and this is to David Moon, but if anybody else wants to chime in, they can. So Zach's question is, why ban parking minimums only for housing within a quarter mile of metro stations? What is the justification for parking minimums farther out or for non-residential units?
None. No, I'm joking. Look, why ban parking minimums only quarter mile for housing? We wanted to see what would happen. Is part of the honest answer. Again, if you understand that the larger enterprise was really about beginning to poke the bear on the housing production crisis and the housing affordability crisis, and whether the state should take a more interventionist role in zoning. That was, again, it seems like, we're watching what's going on in other states, but Maryland generally has not been racing to do things like this. And so it's been a new policy conversation. That being said, we said many times during the bill discussions that California had done half a mile from transit and included commercial and not just residential. And so, there's plenty of data points now that we can point to from other places doing a far more ambitious scope here. There's a further question I see in the chat about what about ADUs? And I think certainly it did dawn on us, and we were thinking that this would, in fact, if we steered it towards the correct implementing agency, that ADUs requirements near a quarter mile from a metro would be similarly evaporated. And it's not clear to me there what the requirement for parking for an ADU right next to the metro station would be. I mean, that's a market that already is renting for below the area median because it's much smaller square footing. So what's the purpose of requiring a parking spot next to that metro station or Purple Line station? So again, we were really trying to set a floor with this debate. And so I want to be very clear with our county partners who are on this webinar too, that we hope and encourage them to go far beyond the actually very narrow application we attempted in our bill. The other reason for it that I'll just point out is that we wanted to tread lightly on the topic of preemption. And so in this case, we chose the Metro and the Purple Line because this isn't just a state intervening on land use, even as a policy matter. We've got skin in the game to the tune of billions of dollars for these infrastructure projects. And in fact, WMATA's coming in for 400 million more. And so we're expected to pony more and more of this up. And there were vast promises made about all of this new transit investment and the way it would play out for housing, sustainability, and transportation, the 15-minute commute, economic development. And again, if we allow these existing rules from the 60s, 80s, 70s, 80s, even up to the 90s to exist, as we make these investments, it really seems like we're missing something here. So that's hopefully some of the context for why we chose that. But again, we hope the county doesn't do what we did. Go bigger.
And Carly, if I could add to that, again, this is my personal opinion, not necessarily the opinion of the commission or the planning department, but I've generally of the opinion, I'm a big baseball fan. I'm a Field of Dreams fan, and I think if you build it, they will come type of thing. And if we have areas of the county where we are building that may be a little bit more car dependent now, and we're building units and we're not requiring the parking there, you're not going to attract the people who need a car. And so we have to think about the implications of that. But it's to that end, I think it's okay for us to not require parking in some of these more areas that are not as transit dependent, because it'll attract the people who will find ways to not need their cars or that parking. I also wanted to just offer some food for thought for Cindy and Chris W. In terms of as they're thinking through the geographies too. We have a couple of other geographies that could be used, and I'm just going to share my screen real quickly. But we have our red policy areas. So these are Delegate Moon talked about maybe something other than a quarter mile. These were generally drawn, these red policy areas, all around all of our red Metro line stations and our Purple Line stations as a half-mile walk shed. So that's something to consider. Another option is our new designation from the Complete Streets Design Guide of area types. We have our downtown and town center area types. Those are the ones in the darkest gray here and the gray with the white hash lines. So maybe some combination of those or something even broader can be considered by the county. Oh, I don't know if those were those being shared while I was saying all that?
I didn't see them. I was just going to say.
There we go. Oh, man. Sorry about that. They know what I'm talking about. Can you see it now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, good. All right. So these are the Complete Streets Design Guide ones. And here are the red policy areas that kind of are the half-mile walk sheds around our red line and purple line stations. I'll stop sharing now.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much. We only have time for a few more questions today. But David Woodward asked, this might be a silly question, but have we seen any new development with 0 parking spaces anywhere in the county? If anybody wants to chime in on that one.
Yeah, and I'll just say quickly, if you've seen the chat, Mike English said I live in one, so.
I did want to be very clear about this too, that it wasn't lost on me as we originally started this exercise that you can waive these parking requirements fairly easily in many instances. And so, and part of, this is why I keep pointing to this larger question about who's controlling land use and where are these new directions going to come from as part of this enterprise. And part of my motivation for being very frank about this too is I do think we don't want to overplay what the impact of parking requirements will be. And I want to also be very clear because there's, again, we want to see what would happen. Part of the test also revealed what some of the confusion was going to be. And we had to immediately stamp back that we were not banning parking near metro stations, because this was immediately where a lot of people went like, oh, where's handicap parking going to go? And have you thought of this? So, well, hold up, we're not banning parking. And so, some of the data I looked at before the bill hearings was like, yeah, you might have a 5% reduction in parking spaces or something like this, when you suspend parking requirements, but for various reasons, the need to finance a project or whatever, the market demand, people are going to build parking spots anyway, even if they are not required to. So I do think it's important for us to be very candid about that. And I think it will actually help us make the case to the public not to be scared about this. The sky is not going to fall if we suspending the parking requirements. In a vacuum, people are going to tend to build parking spots. That's just kind of the world we live in now. Now that gets to a whole nother question about parking maximums. But I won't step into that because while I do agree with that too, that was not the original scope of my bill.
Yeah, and something to that end that we should be thinking about as we look at reforming the parking code here is maybe we should change what types of parking we require, because I think what we currently require is one electric vehicle parking per 100 parking spaces, which, when the zoning code was updated in 2014, I'm not sure we understood the viability of electric vehicles. And they clearly are much more, we need more of that. And so that's something to think about. And I think, I just tried to pull something up. I think that the Guardian building in Silver Spring, which is located at the corner of Cameron and Georgia, will be. That one, I think, went through with no parking required, as an example.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much. These are two questions that are similar and are probably applicable most to Jason, but if Cindy or Chris wants to weigh in as well, feel free. So Ethan Goffman asked, what are the chances of having fees, county or state, for parking, charging for a social and environmental bad, go in public transit, a social and environmental good? And then Tracy Furman asked, can there be incentives for private property owners to participate in a parking district?
I think you're muted, Jason.
Yep. So I'm just trying to find the question because I wanted to see it written out. I saw the one, the incentives. I think that that's a pretty good idea, in terms of the, we do have a good number. I will say this, that in our existing parking lot districts, there's generally a surplus of parking. And I know Chris talked about that's kind of the goal of parking minimums. We have a surplus of parking. And, that's not to say that there aren't particular lots or garages that don't experience parking deficits at certain times in certain locations, but generally across all of these, there's a surplus. And so, but when you throw in all of the private lots and garages that are publicly accessible, we have plenty of parking and plenty of parking for a projected future development too. So, having private participation in that, in making those publicly available is definitely helpful. I was trying to find the first question. If you
could I just put it in the chat as well.
Yeah, okay.
It was, what are the chances of having fees, county or state fees for parking, basically charging for a social and environmental bad and using those to fund public transit?
So I'll jump in here. I don't necessarily have an answer, but, just traditionally and historically, we've used parking fees to support parking infrastructure. But, I definitely like your suggestion. I think it's a really interesting, an important concept to look at. And I'll take it back to Councilmember Friedson.
And Ethan, I think a key part of your recommendation there is just, or your question is just this idea that we should be charging for parking, right? So for so long, we weren't charging for parking in Bethesda or Silver Spring on the weekends, right? And we're still not on Sundays. But we should consider charging what the market will bear in terms of parking, and then we can decide to use that for other public benefits, the revenue that's generated from that.
Great. Well, thank you so much. So we are on to our final questions. We have 2 questions here from Richard Hoy. So the first one is, how are hospitals and federal campuses regulated for parking? And the second is, how can the state and county unbundle parking costs from economic activity at the consumer level? And he says, I'm referring to retail activity in particular, as this affects lower income budgets more so than higher incomes. Grocery prices include the cost of subsidizing free parking unused by some shoppers, subsidizing incentives in gasoline points from purchases, etc. And I can put that in the chat just because it was long.
I'll just take one general stab at this, which is, and I'll sort of relate it back to this question that Ethan Goffman raised about using parking fees for transit. And I'll just say this, I mean, look, you guys know where I stand and what my own sustainability politics are, but what I would say is we're at a very interesting point in these policy debates where there's a ready and willing voice out there that's going to say we are anti-car and pro-transit and couch these as an economic zero-sum decision being foisted by policymakers onto the public. And so whether you're one who happens to use transit or happens to use a car, you're expected to be motivated, by this. And so I just throw that out there as something we are constantly dealing with and trying to find a way forward to show broader public benefits for all of these policy choices that we're making. That's all seems obvious. The pivot I will make here is that the very interesting thing about suspending minimum parking requirements that's been unique about this is that it has this weird quasi-libertarian property rights bit to it, as well as this populist economic bit to it, in terms of reducing sheer cost for renters and people looking for condos or what have you, in a way that's made for very interesting politics on this particular set of issues. And it almost sets it off as a sort of unique, strange bedfellows possibility for the land use politics. And so that was at least lurking as part of the question there. And I pointed out to you again, is, if you introduce parking, maximum parking requirements into it too, you sort of are making a conscious choice to step back into a more regulatory rather than a deregulatory realm. It's not a suggestion to anyone. It's just an observation about how some of these policy choices are playing out in the public debate.
And I would just kind of say, Richard, in terms of unbundling, I think the more unbundling we can do, the more equitable we'll find our policies are in every regard. And then I did take a look at what the code currently requires for hospitals. I think that was specifically asked about, is 1.75 spaces per 1,000 square feet, and that's all across the county. So how that translates, would depend on the size of the hospital.
All right. Well, thank you so much to everyone, everyone who asked amazing questions, all of our speakers tonight. You were fantastic. And I just want to give one final thank you as well to Carly, who has been such a wonderful intern this summer. She did all of the work putting this this webinar together. It was her idea. She did so much of the legwork for it. So I want to give her a round of applause and a round of applause for the rest of our speakers as well, and wish her good luck on starting her master's in public policy classes tomorrow. Woo! So yeah, that's it for our webinar tonight. I am super excited to see this issue move forward in Montgomery County. You will absolutely hear more from me about this. And please, again, if you like the webinar, consider becoming a member of Montgomery for All. And I'm sure you will be hearing from me soon. Have a good night, everyone.